Okay, welcome back, Conrad, for this third episode. Let's get straight into it, and thought we could maybe start talking about the role of aerial views of cities and airports in the theatrical drama of cities. I'm thinking about the drama of approaching a city from the air, the modern experience of seeing a city from above. I can vividly remember as a teenager the drama of flying into Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong and feeling like you were about to crash right into the city and seeing people inside their apartments. And then in cinema, of course, there's things like Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire, which depicts Berlin so lovingly from the air. There's the amazing opening scene in Dirty Harry over San Francisco, which is pre-drone. But now, of course, drone shots make this idea of seeing the city from the air even more common. So maybe we could even also talk about the airport experience, the gateway of this pathway into cities. And there are great examples of these being theatrical moments, but more often they're very disappointingly functional.
Well, I think that, yes, there were three other films that came to mind for me. One was Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, in which Hitler's plane circles or descends through the clouds and Nuremberg is revealed through the clouds. And then from there's a direct transition into the streets with people waving and welcoming the entourage as they arrive from various parts of Germany to lead the rallies. So in a sense, yes, the descent through the cloud is linked with a sense of collectivity in action as part of the propaganda function of that film. The other one is that rather strange introduction to the Blues Brothers, which is aerial views of blast furnaces and steelworks and other such with I think it's helicopter views that are sort of just cruise over whole industrial landscapes, and then there's an abrupt change to inside of when Jake gets released from prison.
That's all right.
The other one was Chris Marker's La Jetée, which I think used Orly Airport as the base and used the neutrality of those Orly buildings. They were just gridded curtain wall buildings, almost sort of selected, you feel, for their neutrality and for their sheer deadpan quality. And the other one was not a film, although it was probably rather filmic in its imagination, and that was the introduction to Robin Boyd's The Australian Ugliness, where you come circling in and you're greeted with kind of murk as Australia reveals itself as a kind of an orange-brown smudge over the Indian Ocean as the super constellation winds its way into Darwin. Traditionally, they used to have to stop there because of range issues. And that was the beginnings of that book were actually drafted when Boyd was overseas in the US. So Robin Boyd may well have drawn on other aviation experiences, I think, as cities or as entities reveal themselves. And in this case, Darwin was still quite small at that point, but Darwin was going to stand for Australia. Darwin and its smudge of a coastline was going to stand for Australia, and the mood would be set. So in a sense, it was an avian imagination that was being brought to bear. Yeah.
It seems there's something particular about the aerial view where you get a sense of the structure of a city and also a sense of its bigness, and so it's a bit like seeing a big sporting event from above as well. It's like you get that sense of the whole drama unfolding.
Because if you get up high enough, you can really sense the scale of cities. I noticed that a favourite way to photograph Australian suburbs is always from up high, so you can just see them spreading and sprawling, and their sense of patterning or their sense of origin or of development tends to be much less evident from that perspective. You just get the sense of spread and sprawl.
And sameness, probably.
And sameness. So in a sense, those viewpoints, those constructs become self-fulfilling prophecies from certain angles, and I think the aviation angle is certainly one of those.
Yeah, additionally as well, it's, also the perspective of just the airport. And I'm thinking about, the famous sort of essay that Koolhaas writes about generic cities, where he's making the correlation between, the sense of how cities are upgrading themselves and redesigning themselves in the same way that airports upgrade themselves. So there's a sort of sense of, commonality, or the fact that you can walk in from one to the other, and it's almost like a completely seamless sort of experience. And I think that's interesting from the perspective of like how, cities sort of compete with one another. But also, when you talked about this experience of the city from above, I mean, I'm also reminded of a lot of the ideas, of Corbusier when he was, he was being flown overhead by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who famously is the author of The Little Prince. And I think that, as I understand, that played quite a big role in the design of the proposition for Algiers. Is that?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, I think it followed the City of 3 Million or the Voisin proposals, which of course took their name from an aviation manufacturer, Voisin, who made bombers during World War One. But yes, after the Saint-Exupéry experiences, certainly Algiers, which is superimposed, a pattern is superimposed, drawing from the coastline at the North African coastline at aviation level, and then it's attached to the old city, which appears as a cluster at one end, then seems to spin out in the crescents of this freeway and the 6 or 7 stories of apartments underneath the freeway. So that, yes, you get the experience of seeing that terrain in an aircraft seems to lead Corbusier into abstract patterns that then spin out of an earlier urban entity or urban form, I think. And there are, in that sense, I think probably the aviation perspective links seamlessly with an older urban form that had little to do really with aviation as a perspective or as a way of experiencing the city. His earlier concept was rather to fuse aviation dimensions and aviation dynamism with Renaissance imagery. So his City of 3 Million presents an airport centre surrounded by his forest of towers, and he really figures it as a city square, as the great piazza in central Florence or the piazza in Siena, with buildings looming around it. So he cast it as a civic space, as a space for the city and the commune come together around a group of Maurice Farman Goliath aircraft which are lined up in the middle of the airport itself.
So speaking of airports and their role in this kind of entryway into a city yourself and experience, you've talked about train stations and as drawing really directly on kind of civic models, even Roman models, and yet airports seem to be an entirely different kind of proposition and so rarely have any of that same drama of the arrival hall, and sort of something they really struggle with.
I think that's interesting. I think it has a lot to do with the evolution of airports, where the railways gobbled up enough area very early on with the establishment of railway companies, particularly in the 1840s and the 1850s, to get large buildings constructed as their terminals, partly as advertisements for the company and so on, so that the Gare de l'Est, de Cunet's Gare de l'Est being a great case in point, as seen in the film Amélie, with its great train wheel window. It was literally like one of those huge driving wheels of those contemporary locomotives, but also with flanking wings that cast it as a kind of villa half in the country, like the Villa Borghese in Rome. And I think that was quite a deliberate combination of factors. But airports had a different pattern of evolution. The aviation community seemed to be rather outside, despite thousands of aircraft being made during World War I, despite thousands of pilots being trained, huge numbers, far more than we imagine actually when you look back retrospectively. But despite that, the aviation community always seemed to be somewhat outside, almost outside of polite society, one feels, as, yes, flyboys being eccentric characters who flew small aircraft. Significant levels of passenger transport didn't really gather momentum until the later 1920s, and then finally the advent of the DC-2 and the DC-3 with regular airline schedules and flights and so on unfolding during the 1930s. So, in other words, they tended to remain groups of sheds. A lot of the time they were hangars, and that you would go to your aircraft, which would be either parked next to a hangar or sometimes even inside the hangar, often from a bus that would take you out from the city and deposit you at a doorway at the side of the hangar. So in other words, they were almost anti-monumental and they were anti-ceremonial forms, I think.
Yeah. There are, of course, exceptions, and your
were significant
beloved Tempelhof in Berlin.
Well,
I
there
was
was
astonished how
Tempelhof.
much that's like a civic building.
Yeah. And there was a tendency in the US to construct buildings that were like large masonry compounds. It's probably a reflection of the strength of Beaux-Arts classicism, that the Americans felt they had to make a compositional effort with their terminal buildings, particularly as control towers began to develop in the really through the 1920s and the 1930s, when there was a need to actually have aircraft directed visually on airfields and directed towards the terminals in various ways, and to provide flashing beacons for pilots to navigate and find their way towards the airports, given that there was no radar. And airports such as Grand Central Terminal, significantly named, rather as the Grand Central Terminal in New York, but Los Angeles gained a Grand Central Air Terminal at Burbank, just across the Hollywood Hills from both central Los Angeles and from Hollywood itself. You went over the hills into the valley, and Burbank was nearby. And that was a Spanish mission terminal. So in other words, it was a kind of cottagey or hacienda or mission building that was adapted to presumably some sort of sense of permanence and architectural investment. But it replaced what were basically groups of tin sheds. In Australia, that happened much later. You got monumental buildings to a standard federal aviation department design, about 3 or 4 of them. Melbourne's wasn't built. Adelaide's, Brisbane's and Sydney's were. And until the 1970s, you could still see bits of them poking out at the Sydney terminal. Brisbane and Adelaide moved their terminals, so they were left as the light civil aviation airports, Archer Field and Para Field, respectively. So in other words, yes, you do get an architectural investment slowly unfolding in Australia, and we're talking about, in the case of those buildings, about 1938 to 1941.
Right. And again, Conrad, perhaps another dimension of the cities as theatres is probably the realm of stadia, where some of these sort of relationships are perhaps more explicitly choreographed, but not necessarily covered within the conception of city design or city planning. And so Melbourne Cricket Ground is perhaps is the largest sporting arena in Australia, and in there we can sit with 100,000 other people. So huge sporting events are often the biggest gatherings in a city, and most cities have some version of this. But it's particularly prominent in a city like Melbourne and in Melbourne's history. I'm also aware that the biggest crowds ever in the space were probably during a religious revival, events of the 1950s, the evangelist Billy Graham, and in 1959 with the Catholic conventions.
One of those apostolic conventions, yes. The previous one had used Victoria Street and the top of MacArthur Street in East Melbourne, actually, for a huge gathering in the late 1930s, I think it was, which also celebrated the completion of St Patrick's Cathedral. So, in that case, an intersection of streets was the gathering point, as it would become in later years with demonstrations at Flinders Street and Swanson Street, but we might go into that in
Yeah.
a little while.
And also, also thinking that, even as even last year, Taylor Swift played to record crowds of 96,000 people in the same stadium, and this was, I think, statistically her largest audience in ever. So I think, so they do present, I think, a kind of specific scale that's only possible within that environment. But they also have, I think, very strong kind of relationships with how we think about the city and its sort of connections with theatre, that matters. So I was wondering what your kind of thoughts are about this in terms of how it has played out historically as well.
Yes, I think there was a great deal of significance attached to Melbourne Cricket Ground, for example, but probably other stadia as well, very early. A phenomenon in Australian cities is executive streets, where legislative buildings will be gathered along a particular street, and I think we've talked a bit about that before. But I think very much in addition to the Parliament and the old Treasury and the Model School, you've got two significant additions in the 1870s. You've got the exhibition buildings, or the Royal Exhibition Building of 1879 to 80 at one end, at the northern end of this executive axis running along one side of Melbourne's grid. And on the south end, you had the developing MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, first with the so-called reversible stand, again from the 1870s, because there were actually two ovals and not one. There was an oval to the west, which was later taken up with railway yards and now has an Ashton Raggett McDougall building, tall one sited there. And so the original grandstands tended to cater for both fields. So the cricket ground was on the east side, and I think, although I think that it varied, but I think the football ground was on the west side. So there was that. But also you began to get then a shift to have all sport on one oval, and that meant a spread of grandstands running around. Where I think it became transformed into a great arena was probably with the Southern Stand in 1937, which was built to capitalise on large crowds coming to the Bradman-era tests, particularly the so-called Revenge series after Bodyline, which was 1937. I think they still lost to Gubby Allen's side, actually, but I think they might have won the test after that after the Southern Stand was built, and later. Interestingly enough, it housed the Marine divisions which were brought into Australia for attacking Guadalcanal in the Pacific War. They were basically put up at the Southern Stand because it sheltered people from the southwesterly wind, I suspect, more than anything. And it was in summer, so you didn't have to heat the place or anything. So people just camped in the Southern Stand. So it became a huge military establishment as well, briefly. But also it turned the Melbourne Cricket Ground into an arena, into a great coliseum with all the overtones of gladiatorial contests and blood that had become increasingly associated with cricket and with fast bowling, particularly in the Jardine Tour of 1932-33, I think it was. So you got that, but you also got the MCG emerging very rapidly as a collective, as a great gathering place. It was clearly the largest such space that you could get in Melbourne, really. And so that in itself guaranteed it preeminence as a collective realm.
And it's the sense that it is an urban place like a city which transcends the buildings. So we can keep replacing the buildings, and once a collection of buildings is a bit more singular now.
Because it was 6 or 7 originally.
And so it's the arena in the middle.
It was a great
which
clustering of buildings around the sacred turf.
Right, and it's the turf that gets preserved, and then the buildings just seem to keep evolving and
buildings
upgrading.
keep getting replaced. The only reason the Southern Stand was replaced was the advent of corporate boxes, so that you began to get a separation, of a greater level of crowd separation into those who chose to pay for corporate accommodation, as the phrase would have it, and those who would stand. So originally,
but even that's a kind of a theatrical operatic idea where you get the
Yes.
the boxes for.
Yes, it is for the boxes for people up in the circle, really, because that in some ways the MCG began to evolve rather like that of an opera theatre, with multiple circles of seats stacked up in a ring around the stage,
Right.
as it were. And I think that sense has actually become heightened as the grandstands, which are now only two, got taller and taller, and the raking of the seats got steeper and steeper, so that you're now almost sort of looking down as almost into the mouth of a volcano. And the sensation's not unlike that in some of the big auditoria, such as Hamer Hall, which I think was almost 3,000 seats, which is very large for a classical music auditorium. And rather Piranesian in terms of that sense of looking down into a volcano or into a great sort of opening void with the orchestra down there somewhere, and with the walls spray painted and configured in lozenges and in a kind of rough rock-like texture, almost like being inside a giant cave. And there's quite an interesting correspondence, I think, between both the Melbourne Cricket Ground and, say, a large auditorium like Hamer Hall.
Well, that's a good segue to talk about Hamer Hall, and let's keep moving around the city. Talk a bit about the arts precinct in Melbourne or any other city. So it seems like a case in point where, as an urban theatre, it has all of the elements that you've discussed in your lectures of urban theatre. It's a campus-like collection of buildings, has its iconic spire, sort of curates or composes a major street boulevard, and then forms a kind of a gateway into the city. Not literally an archway, but there is an archway, of course, for the National Gallery of Victoria.
Yes, that's interesting. Yes, the imprint of ceremonial archways, because it was a part of St Kilda Road and Princes Bridge, which was periodically fitted out with celebratory arches for particular occasions.
I think there was actually a competition for one in the 1990s in a temporary.
There was, and there was. I think it was John Truscott might have had a hand in the final version of the arch. I'm trying to remember what the celebratory occasion was. Might have been the millennial arch, or a celebration of the millennium change. But there were other arches. I think there might have been one for Queen Elizabeth in 1954. There was certainly coronation arches, and for Australian Federation in 1901, and I think for the Australian Centennial in 1888. Generally, they were modelled on Roman triumphal arches, so that the implication was you marched through the arch and became curiously sanctified by the process of going under an arch, going through an arch, which had been part of Roman arches' role in the divine, in projecting the divine back onto military triumphs and military activity. And in that sense, a pervasive model in Melbourne thinking was the Paris Arc de Triomphe, as much as Roman triumphal arches.
I mean, the cultural forum, or as it's called in Berlin, is a theatre type that is understood in lots of cities. And currently, Herzog and de Meuron have a project under construction in between Sharon's Philharmonie and Mises National Gallery.
That's
right.
right.
It's a real campus built out of a wasteland.
Yeah, because there's a bit of a void between Philharmonie and the National Gallery. There's a lovely little church that Albert Stuhler did in the 1840s, but there's actually a bit of an aching void. So it's interesting to see that. And that had a particular role at one stage because it was right up against the Berlin Wall. So it was actually a projection of the great moments in German culture straight up against this concrete block wall that ran along the edge of the Cultural Forum. That's now gone, and the Cultural Forum has been filled out with other components as well, particularly the Holocaust Memorial of Peter Eisenman's.
I'm also thinking, I guess circling back to Paris, I think it's also one of the things that becomes quite evident when you consider, the Paris Opera House and the Charles Garnier sort of project, where there is again this sort of choreography or cultural condensation that happens, just starting the building and how, the different levels allow for different, strata of society at the time to kind of circulate to the building, but then also moments where there's again a kind of a meeting of the different classes, and then you kind of separate back into the opera house. It's again a sort of really interesting sort of civic sort of choreography that plays out and completely condensed into a building.
And through circulation, I think Garnier almost sort of represented Paris in the movement of people inside that building, so that Paris lived through great masses in popular movements. But there was also, of course, a stratification according to financial background and according to class, that the everyday people of Paris would enter through the great colonnade at the front of the opera, but bourgeois people would enter through a wing that projected one side, and the imperial family and the great dignitaries, the high-ups in France, would enter from another wing on the opposite side of the opera. So in other words, there were three major points of entry, and they would then mingle in that realm of the ceremonial staircase and the huge chandelier in the central foyer, as represented in stage sets for the Phantom of the Opera, where they take Garnier's foyer, his communal foyer, as the model for the spaces, and then people split apart from that and they go into transverse galleries, and they proceed off into various conduits, corridors, tunnels, vestibules, and then they all rejoin each other again in the auditorium. So they actually have two convergence points within the opera building. Now, there are parallels for this in other opera houses, particularly a great many 19th century opera houses, I think. I think you'd probably find similar elements in Gottfried Zemper's opera house in Dresden, and the Frankfurt Oper, and even Lemberg, or what's now Lviv in Ukraine, had a most imposing Austrian pattern opera house, where again you'd get this choreography of the city would be drawn together. And Garnier was very conscious of that.
I mean, Garnier's operas, it's kind of amazing from all the interior experience that you describe, but also the extent to which it holds a whole sort of series of converging streets.
Yes.
At its centre.
Yes, street-like, and it's street-like in scale. They're urban streets in width and proportions.
Conrad, you've described in your lectures the street as the venue of the massive event. And we were remembering the protests of the Iraq invasion in 2003, where there were near to 500,000 people in Swanston Street, spreading from the State Library to a quite nearly complete Federation Square. In fact, this was the first time we'd seen it filled. And there are plenty of examples of the street becoming both a stage and the audience mosh pit. And I'm wondering if you see this as a particularly modern phenomenon.
Yes, mosh pit particularly. Yes, that springs to mind, particularly at various of the more congested points in the 500,000 demonstration. There were certainly antecedents in the Vietnam moratoria, which gathered in the city and involved a long march along Burke Street, as I recall, up to Spring Street, and parts of it also going up Collins Street, as I recall. Because the final gathering point was actually outside the old Treasury rather than Parliament House. Parliament House had been traditionally the termination point for major demonstrations and for trade union parades, was to go up Burke Street and then turn around in Burke Street and gather in front of that colonnade, which seemed to absorb the force, the spatial force encompassed in Burke Street. And I think something similar happened with Collins Street and the Old Treasury. I'm not quite sure, though, why the Old Treasury ended up becoming a gathering place, except that the Treasury Gardens were next door to it, so people could fan out into the Treasury Gardens while still hearing the speakers from in front of the 5 great arches. And that was another building that literally absorbed the spatial pressure, in that case of Collins Street, into its facade, almost as if the building was sculpted and indented at the centre by the presence of a great city street or axis in front of it. So both of those government buildings made effectively democratic gestures to Melbourne. They utilised the streets, they made them into great axes. But the Vietnam moratoria were probably the most direct precursor to the Iraq war demonstrations, which were 2003, and they were followed up fairly directly by another very large demonstration against work choices in 2007, which came as a march from the Trades Hall, and there had been other Trades Hall marches down Swanston Street. I think the gathering point there became Swanston Street and Flinders Street. And certainly in subsequent demonstrations, the Flinders Street-Swanston Street intersection has become a major focus, almost a kind of terminating focus.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about the democratic nature of the way a building is positioned within a street and that ability to absorb. I mean, another example of a different kind of theatre would be something like the Sydney Opera House, which is a pretty special case study in terms of it being an urban icon that's defining a city. And I guess in that sense, it's very much about the building being theatrical in acting as a backdrop to events rather than the idea of absorbing. Have you got any thoughts on that? The sort of urban theatre with the building as an actor. I mean, we see it at New Year's Eve. It's such a sort of visible...
With the bridge and the fireworks on the bridge as its immediate backdrop.
That's right. Type of
the two
theatre
are
in
always
itself.
superimposed.
Yeah.
In some ways, the Opera House works a bit differently from the Melbourne buildings we were talking about a minute ago, in the sense that it's off on a promontory. It's at the end of a... It's at the end of a curving walkway that's several hundred metres long, and it's got parkland immediately behind it, and nothing but the harbour immediately behind that, until you get a backdrop of suburbs on the other side, north side of the harbour. And I'm trying to think where the equivalent focus of demonstrations in Sydney is. I think traditionally Martin Place was a contained urban space in the centre of the city, and I think it was quite consciously developed as a quasi piazza. Originally, it was an alleyway, and it coincided with the construction of the General Post Office down one side, which then had a loggia so that people could walk in the shade of the loggia, and you got swirling crowds in Martin Place in front of the post office. And it led directly off George Street at one end and Pitt Street at the other, which are two very heavily trafficked streets in central Sydney. But I'm trying to think of other gathering places in Sydney. I could think George Street would certainly qualify. Circular Quay would work as a gathering place. I would think Belmore Park opposite Central Railway Station would work as a gathering place. This is in addition to Martin Place. But yes, the Opera House is curious in that sense. It's more a representation of the city in collectivity as an abstract rather than as a direct physical backdrop.
Yeah, it does. It works obviously as an incredibly powerful sort of abstract icon, but I'm always amazed how much it's like an urban building when you're up at its steps.
This is the thing, that people dwell incessantly on sails on the harbour and nature and the property of Sydney's hilly terrain. They talk about the physical geography of the place. But there seems to me to have been, over a long period, a colossal underestimation of the degree to which the Opera House works as an urban form. It works as a collectivity almost of Gothic arches, or pointed arches and rib construction, not unlike the highly stylised film sets of Ingmar Bergman films in the 1950s, which was, of course, a period when the building was taking shape and changing its geometry in relation to structural necessities, but also that Jörn Utzon himself came from background, or from his immediate sort of activity, was designing collective housing in Denmark around, well, there's one group in Elsinore, and there are other housing developments that he was involved with. And so he was looking very much at village or town-like collectivities in urban form. And yet Australia interpreted the Opera House collectively as a kind of an exquisite pavilion icon.
Well, it seems to me that's very much because of how it's situated, and the location of a building really contributes to how it's read and understood, and because it's got the harbour and lots of
on three
space
sides.
around it.
Yes,
We don't often pick up on that urban sensitivity that really it does have, as you say, Graham, when you get up close.
I don't know if you've seen that astonishing video promoting the building and its renovation called the Ship Song Project, and it's really fabulous. And it begins in the underbelly of the building, and it ends with the shells literally as a silhouette on the water. And it goes through the whole breadth of the experiences in between, including the steps and the interior halls and so on.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like it's a building doing a lot of hard work at a lot of different levels.
Yeah. And to some extent, it's the city in a single building. But at the same time, it also had other characteristics, even in relation to the water and seeing it as an object surrounded by the water. There was, of course, a clear precedent for that with Stockholm's town hall by Ragnar Östberg in the 1900s, where the town hall is literally on a promontory of sorts out into one arm of Stockholm harbour. And so it reads as sitting on the water, and in the evening you get the reflection of lights on the water around the building in a way that is strongly recalled, I think, in the Opera House. But the other tradition for the Opera House, which is rather interesting, was the German expressionist tradition of die Stadtkrone, or the urban crown, so that the central business district of Sydney, all the diversity of Sydney's buildings is somehow swept up and stylised, rendered abstract to a degree, but also retaining the same tumult of the central city in those sails. They were more than simply graceful yacht sails. They actually had a real tumult to them. Now, that may have been accentuated by the Ove-Arup revisions to the structure, which altered the geometry and pushed the building upwards and made it much more vertical in its proportions than the original concept. But at the same time, it seemed a way of stylising the city.
That's so interesting, because Utzon was very insistent that the rib structure was visible and not a kind of not clad. And it is very, very muscular when you're close
and
up.
one of the pleasurable aspects of the building is seeing the great concrete ribs burst through screens of vertical timber planking, so that there's this radical juxtaposition between the two. He's in the same territory as Alvar Aalto there and Hans Scharoun.
I think, Conrad, a lot of the thinking about the drama of cities seems to hinge around this idea of condensation, or the culture of congestion, as Rem Koolhaas calls it in Delirious New York, and even if it's just locally, but there's also a sort of in the Australian context, there's also the dream of sort of the sprawling, or low density city, and perhaps also captured by David Lynch, who went a long way to describe the small town or Los Angeles in theatrical terms. And we also
Lost Highway and films like that. Yeah.
Yes, and we also see, the example of The Truman Show by Peter Weir.
Yes.
That sort of captures a similar kind of dimension. And but also Edmond and Corrigan, building a theatre around the Australian suburb. Now, Lynch would also say good fiction doesn't necessarily make a good life. So I'm wondering about the suburb as a venue for drama.
Because some concepts of the city were broad enough to encompass theatrical dimension in a range of circumstances. I'm thinking particularly of Berthold Brecht's idea of the instant theatre of the street, that city streets particularly, but arguably suburban streets in all manner of circumstances, gained through the movement of people in them, people's interactions, people's visiting of shops, the reflection of people in shop windows, that in a sense even suburban streets acquired a strong sense of being both theatre backdrops and probably stage-like spaces as well, and processional spaces. And that when people were walking along a city street, you had theatre. And that was picked up in early 20th century photography in interesting ways too, where quite often there'd be a photograph of part of a building, usually a fairly inert part of a building, with people walking in front of it. And I think that was an interesting connection, because Edmond and Corrigan were also very interested in the Berthold Brecht idea of the instant theatre of built circumstance in people's lives in cities. So you did have that connection. And with suburbs, I think the argument went, and I think this probably also was entertained in America via the focusing of a strand of American literature around often even quite quiet main streets in smaller towns, as with Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, which comes to stand for the hopes and the social positioning of the people in a small, I think it was Minnesota community, and particularly of a woman who had a great potential in terms of career and of social promise, who settles for life in a small town. And Sinclair Lewis locates that town around its main street. And you had something very similar unfolding with Thornton Wilder's Our Town, which was written, I think, in the late 1930s and is constantly performed as theatre and as speculating and reminiscing on the lives of people in a small community. And then you had it being picked up by Robert Venturi in Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, where he took it was an interesting sequence of events. Robin Boyd had published The Australian Ugliness, in which he condemned most things about suburban Australia as indicative of fundamental malaise in the Australian social condition, and about mess and chaos and a lack of visual order in suburban surroundings. And Peter Blake, who was a noted architectural commentator and editor of the Architectural Forum, took that, and he wrote a very similar book called God's Own Junkyard. And he compared what he saw as the chaos and the ugliness and the lack of coordination and visual order of American main streets and so-called road town highway streetscapes with New England villages and pastoral settings of 18th century buildings. And Venturi was struck by this, and he said, besides the irrelevancy of the comparison, in other words, what exactly is the point of comparing 18th century villages, churches, white-walled buildings, to road town, which has been generated for completely different purposes? And he argued instead, is not Main Street almost all right? And what could be done to make Main Street all right? And he said, perhaps more signs, more concentrated. In other words, that yes, there was an order to be found in signs in which eloquence within a modern automotive setting could be enhanced. It's just it hadn't been done at this point. And I think that the result, the longer term result of that, of course, was when Denise Scott Brown, Stephen Eisenhower and Robert Venturi then went to Las Vegas and studied how signage worked in relation to otherwise fairly simple buildings at that time, which were the shed-like casinos of the 1960s. Now, that's all changed in Las Vegas now, because you've got major monumental and highly sculptural structures enveloping the casinos and amplifying their presence. But originally you had a dual hierarchy of signage, heraldic symbolism, as I think Denise Scott Brown called it, and shed-like buildings. Hence the Venturi's idea that an adaptable and applicable architecture might be decorated sheds, as they called it.
Yeah, I mean, really, are we talking about the relationships between all these elements and people that really makes it theatrical? And I've always looked at Lyubov Popova's stage set. She was a Soviet Union set designer, artist, and she did this quite extraordinary set for a theatre called The Magnanimous Cuckold in 1922, and it was very much about that relationship between the actors and how they interacted with this very Soviet-looking, almost, I guess it was, the idea was that it was a proletariat sort of workers set, so it was very much about something that was always changing and transforming. And really, when I think about the city as a theatre, it's about the relationship of all these elements as a very dynamic condition.
It is, well, yes, and I think Lyubov Popova's set, it was a combination of wheels that were turning around, there were ladders, people were running upstairs, up timber, seemingly hastily built timber frames, gantries, scaffolding almost,
Yes.
which suggested city buildings, and they certainly, her sets certainly suggested urban congestion.
Absolutely, yeah.
While at the same time they were almost constructivist paintings and shapes that were turned into 3 dimensions, and then the actors performed in that, primarily by movement, because there was a lot of challenge in the Soviet avant-garde to the idea of actors standing and speaking their lines and speaking their pieces. There was much more emphasis on kinetic movement, and in some ways I think Lyubov Popova's stage sets were a theatre parallel to probably Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, which was about a day in the life of a modern Soviet city. And as part of the collective idea, the identity of actors and stars was subordinated to the idea of multiple action by people in an urban environment. So you didn't, and so with Lyubov Popova, you didn't get a complete building as you might have often got in sets. Palladio gave you a whole collection of completed buildings in the Teatro Olimpico in the 16th century in Vicenza. But no, Lyubov Popova didn't present you with a completed building. She presented you with the framework of buildings, and she presented you with movement as incorporated within structure and within a frame structure.
Yeah, and so the Pompidou Centre that we were talking about in another episode really comes to mind in that sort of relationship where it really invites, with a big staircase on the outside and structure, and it
People
really does.
going up the escalators on
up
the
the
outside
escalator,
of the
yes.
building.
That's right, exactly.
And there's constant movement. Even the floor shudders when you walk on it. You feel like you're walking on a
Could be
great envelope of plywood.
Yeah.
I feel like this discussion will lead quite nicely into our next episode, your theme of cities as arenas for social change. I think we could talk so much more about the urban theatre. It's sort of one wonderful topic, but we should wrap and see you for the next episode, Conrad.
Right. Yes.